everyone, and welcome back to the journey of my YouTube channel. I am glad to be back to it myself after a rather long and wonderful Christmas break, and then also after the break that I took from normal booktube stuff to talk about my own story that was releasing in the Voices of the Future anthology last month. So it was very fun to share with you guys about that and to celebrate with everybody about that, but I haven't made like a normal booktube kind of video in a long time because I took a brief break from booktube. That's a tongue twister, before I even helped release the anthology, so it has really been a minute, but I had to make a top 10 of 2023 video because top 10 lists of favorite books from the previous year are like my favorite type of video, my favorite type of email to write. I just think it's so fun to look back on the previous year and decide which books I like the best, and then to see which books other people like the best from their year, and then start building up my TBR for the next year, which of course is always way too long, although my TBR for this year isn't actually as extensive as usual, but that's for another video. One interesting thing about my top 10 list this year is that it is actually all fantasy, which I don't think has ever happened before, because usually I have a few like Victorian era classics in there, or like some really ancient classics, or some sci-fi almost always, maybe a historical fiction or two. I usually have more genre variety than just fantasy, and I did read some really good classics this year. I did read To Kill a Mockingbird this year, which I feel like, just full disclosure, because some of you might be upset that I read that and didn't put it on my top 10 list, I really did like it. I really did. And that was the case with a lot of the other non-fantasy books that I read this year, and I liked them, but just the fantasy I read this year was so good it kind of blew the other ones out of the water. So I think you'll also find that there is a lot of variety in this list. Some of these books I wouldn't even say are primarily fantasy, but they all have fantasy elements. They are kind of more fantasy than anything else, with one possible exception that we will get to. But just in general, I loved a lot of the fantasy that I read this year, even more than I love the other types of books that I read. And I think that's exciting in a sense, because I feel like I'm learning more about what I really enjoy in fantasy books. And so hopefully I can implement that in the books that I pick in 2024, so that I will get better and better at reading fantasy that is so good that it shows up on my top 10 list at the end of the year. Before we get to the actual list, I do have one more thing to touch on first, which is an honorable mention. I could have listed so many books as honorable mentions. I kind of already did list To Kill a Mockingbird as an honorable mention, but one more that I just really need to address is Rhythm of War, which is, of course, book 4 in the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. I read it this year and it was really good, and it probably deserves to be on this list, but I tend to rank books in series. So I felt like, since this is book 4 of a series, it's not a whole story by itself, and so I felt like it didn't make the most sense to put it on this list, because it takes so much background to understand and appreciate it. But I really did appreciate it. I would say that it is pretty definitely my favorite Stormlight book so far. That's kind of a controversial opinion. I think a lot of people didn't like Rhythm of War as much as Way of Kings or Words of Radiance, but I actually think this was my favorite one so far. I really felt like this is where Stormlight Archive finally is the series that it has been growing into the whole time. The first 2 books were a lot of setup. They were very good setup, but they were a lot of setup. And then the middle book was the middle book, naturally, but then this one, as book 4 of the 5-book arc, is really delivering on what the previous 3 books promise. And I thought that the character relationships in this one were really interesting. There was a lot of good character growth. There were action scenes that I liked. So let me know if you agree with that. If you're a Stormlight fan, is it at all acceptable that I think that Rhythm of War is the best one? I don't know, but I did really like it. It is not absent from my main top 10 list because I didn't like it that much, just because this is what I did with Oathbringer last year. And so I thought it would only be fair to do the same thing with Rhythm of War as I did with Oathbringer. And if I'm being honest, the main reason that I do this with Stormlight books is so that I am able to talk about more books on my main top 10 list. Speaking of which, let's actually get into that top 10 list now, and we do not have to go very far away in the literary world for number 10, Tress of the Emerald Sea, which is also by Brandon Sanderson, also in the Cosmere universe, like the Stormlight Archive. To read this book, I broke a promise that I had made to myself. I had promised very solemnly and sincerely that I was only going to read one Brandon Sanderson book in 2023, and it was going to be Rhythm of War. I had just read so many Brandon Sanderson books in 2022. I made a video about them, talking about all the different Brandon Sanderson books that I read in 2022. It was just a lot, and it was great. 2022 was my year of Sanderson, and it's not like that was a bad thing, but I was just like, okay, I am not going to read that many Brandon Sanderson books this year. I'm going to make some space for some other books, for some other authors, and I was only going to read Rhythm of War this year. And I was especially not going to read any of the secret projects, but this one is BookTube's fault. It really is, because I heard so many people talking about how good Tress was and talking about the piratey adventure aspects of it, and that it was just a very fun story with really likable characters. And I was like, well, if it's that good, I guess I better. So I did. I gave in and I read it, and I did not regret it. I really enjoyed it a lot. It was definitely a very fun and adventurous story, like BookTube had told me. What I didn't expect primarily was the details of the world building. I should have known, since it's a Brandon Sanderson book, that the world building was going to be very unique, but I wasn't prepared for it to be quite that unique. And maybe initially, like, it threw me off a little bit just how different it was from anything else I'd seen before, but I definitely got used to it and really enjoyed a lot just how unique and extremely Brandon Sanderson it was, because in some ways the plot is a very typical adventure plot, which I loved about it. I thought that was great, but the world building also makes it the most uniquely, distinctively Brandon Sanderson thing ever. So if you are a fan of Brandon Sanderson's world building, you will be a fan of it in this book too. I thought it did a good job of fitting within the bigger Cosmere universe and referencing some Cosmere things in fun ways without making it too dependent on the rest of the Cosmere universe. So that's why I can talk about this one not as part of a series, because it is really a standalone. I like that about it. It could be a very good entry point into reading Brandon Sanderson, to reading the Cosmere. There are so many little details that you won't get unless you have read literally all the Cosmere books. There were some references that I was like, I don't get that, but I know that's a Cosmere reference. So that was kind of fun. Sort of made me want to read the few Cosmere books that I have not read yet. And of course, the other very distinctively Brandon Sanderson thing about it is the plot twist. There was one plot twist especially that really got me. It really did. And I don't feel like it should have. I think I should have seen it coming. Other people have said they did see it coming. So I probably should have caught it a mile away. Maybe you will. I didn't get it. I missed it. So I did really enjoy that reveal. And I also thought the characters in this were really good, which sometimes in Sanderson books I don't connect to the characters quite as much as I do in some of my other favorite books. But I did really like the characters in this. They all, even kind of the more minor characters, which I mean, there's a joke about the very minor characters, but even the not main characters had a lot of very distinctive things about them, not just physically, but in terms of their internal character work and who they were as people. I thought Tress's character arc was very good. I really liked the villain, the friendship aspect and the dynamics with the crew. I really liked a lot, and I also appreciated that it didn't feel like it had to be the world's most heavy, dark, gritty realism story. That it enjoyed just having a good time and being a little bit more lighthearted and not having to make everything just as sad and emotionally disastrous as possible. I think we need some stories that are okay with being happier and lighter in some ways. It definitely wasn't just fluffy and nothing important happened. It had real stakes and everything, but I did like that it didn't have to be the most serious thing in the world. The reason that I didn't put this any higher on the list, I probably could have. I really think I probably could have, but the narrative voice actually wasn't my favorite. I know a lot of people, that's like their favorite thing about it. It is told in a very distinct, unique narrative voice that I don't want to say too much about because it's kind of a spoiler if you're familiar with the Cosmere at all. Most people on BookTube probably know already, but in case you don't, that's okay. I won't spoil it for you. You can find it out for yourself. A lot of people love it, so there's a very high chance that you'll love it too, but I just felt like it distanced me from the characters a little bit, and there are a lot of kind of asides, and some of the like philosophical but humorous rambling asides I did enjoy, and some of them I felt just didn't land for me. So you might really feel like they do, but I kind of didn't. I felt like I would have enjoyed the story a little bit more if it had been from Tress's point of view instead, because I think we could have connected to her even more that way and felt like we were experiencing this along with her rather than very much watching her from the outside. So I think maybe that would have been a little bit more my preference, but maybe if I reread it, I won't feel the same way again. The next book I don't own, unfortunately, so I can't show you a physical copy of it, but it is Assassin's Apprentice. That is number 9 on my list. Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb, which is another one that I read because of BookTube. I hadn't even really heard of this book before BookTube. I probably seen it in Barnes & Noble, but didn't really know what it was until BookTube started talking about the series, and I was like, okay, I think I really need to read this. And I did, and again, I was glad that BookTube talked me into it. I was also glad, I thought from the covers that it was going to be a little bit more lighthearted and even middle grade, which Assassin's Apprentice, the character is quite young. He's kind of middle grade age, but I wouldn't really say it's a middle grade book. Thankfully, my friend Danny Dabbles did warn me that it was going to be very emotionally intense, and so I was just glad knowing, like, okay, that's the tone of this thing. It's not as, like, fun and bouncy as I thought maybe it was going to be. So that was definitely good to know going in. And yes, it is very emotionally intense, and I really liked that about it. I thought the character work was really good. Very quickly, I cared a lot about the main character and really all of the characters that we were meeting. They were all so different and so interesting in their own ways, and I was always like, okay, what are they going to do next? How are they going to interact with each other next? There are a lot of characters where it's like, I like all of these people, and yet they're having a lot of trouble with each other, and I wish that they could just work it out. And so there's a lot of tension in that way that I thought was well done. In a sense, it's not the kind of thing that I would have thought would be my favorite, since the plot is pretty slow, and I think of myself as a reader who enjoys a lot of very fast-paced plot, a lot of action. But I think one thing I learned about myself as a reader this year is that I actually like character-driven and character-focused stories more. I don't care as much about the fast plots if I don't care about the characters. And if I care about the characters, then I don't care if literally nothing is happening. I will just enjoy reading about the characters. So this is kind of that sort of story. It's not that nothing is happening. Stuff definitely is happening, especially political intrigue. And that's kind of the thing, that what is happening, plot is not action scenes, it's not a quest, it all takes place in one location. It's very small scale in a sense, but it really digs deep into that location and into everybody who lives within this one castle, everything that's going on within this one castle, all of the politics and magic and bad family history, and just all of the character dynamics are really what make this story happen. And the story of this little boy growing up, the writing is very atmospheric. I thought it did a really good job of making me feel like I was in this castle and was experiencing all of these fantasy castle vibes. This book also really made me care about the dogs in it, which I'm not particularly a dog person. I've never had a dog, so usually dogs in stories, other people are crying about them, and I'm like, oh, the dog, that's too bad. So I don't usually have that much of a connection to dogs in stories, but this book made me care so much about the dog parts of the stories and about the dog characters, but even more about the impact that the dogs were having on the main character, and the way that they were worked into the magic system I thought was really cool. The animal side of the magic system I thought was very neat, and I was really enjoying reading about it, and like, oh my goodness, what is going to happen next? Now, the other half of the magic system, I guess, there are other elements of the magic system, but one of the main elements of the magic system is basically just telepathy, and it just felt kind of average. So many magic systems are basically just telepathy, and I did think it was executed well in the book, and I thought it fit with what was going on with the book, especially in the climax. I thought that the use of the magic was really neat, and the way that it combined with the animal magic I thought was very interesting. But just the skill, as this magic system is called on its own, I thought was just pretty average. It was just kind of your typical fantasy magic system where it's like, oh, if you try really hard, you can communicate with other people's minds. So I've just seen that a lot, and I wasn't too excited about that. So that's one reason why this isn't higher on the list. And the other reason is book 2 in the series, Royal Assassin, I did not like nearly as much. I was really hoping that the whole trilogy was going to be something I would be very enthusiastic about, but book 2 I didn't like as much. I did feel like it fell into being very slow, and it felt like not a lot was happening, even though there was still political intrigue. And the main character was just making so many bad decisions. I was like, why did you do that? Why did you do that? And then I read some reviews about book 3, and it sounds like people are saying that that just happens more in book 3. So if you've read book 3, please let me know if I will want to read it, because I kind of want to finish the trilogy. I kind of want to know what happens. I do still care about these characters. A lot of cool stuff did happen in book 2. There were things about it that I liked a lot. So let me know if I will like book 3 better, or if I should just move on to Ship of Magic by Robin Hobb, because I definitely do want to read that. Number 8 is Agnes at the End of the World by Kelly McWilliams. And this is the one on the list that is arguably not fantasy, or not primarily fantasy, but it does have what I would consider to be fantasy elements. It's primarily dystopian, but not in a sci-fi kind of way. It's not like there's advanced technology or even an advanced government. It's primarily fantasy causing dystopia in the real world. So I would still say that it is fantasy, but this is the least fantasy book on my list. What actually caught my attention about this one is that it has a type 1 diabetic character. I am also type 1 diabetic, and there are just not many books that talk about it, which is kind of crazy because there are a lot of diabetic people. It's kind of odd that not more books talk about that. So I was very curious how that was going to be represented in the book and if it was going to be accurate. And I was just interested to read a book about someone who has the same condition as I do. The main character doesn't, her little brother does, which I think worked out pretty well. I actually thought that aspect of the story was handled very well. The author obviously did a lot of research. She had a diabetic friend read through it and give feedback on it. So for the most part, it was really good. There were a few points where I was like, that's unlikely to happen. It technically could. It's not super likely, but for the most part, it definitely felt well researched, and I felt like it was just handled very well in terms of attitude toward the disease and the way that the person who had diabetes was treated and cared for and everything. I did like how it worked in the climax. I'm trying not to give spoilers, but it did play into the climax, and I thought that was done well, and it didn't feel too much like a cheap, we're using this to add artificial tension to the story. It felt very natural as part of the story, and I also felt like she didn't hold back from letting the diabetes aspect of the story be as important to the story as it could be. I felt like she fully utilized that element in the story. It didn't just feel tacked on because it was convenient for one scene or one plot point or something. Once again, the main thing about this book for me was the characters. I just thought the characters were so good and their dynamics were so good, especially the family that's at the center of the story. That's Agnes and her younger siblings. I just really liked reading about them and really cared about them. And I especially thought it was interesting the contrast between Agnes and her next sister after her in age, Beth, and just how they respond to this environment that they've grown up in such different ways, and then how their paths don't go the way that you would expect it to, because Agnes is the one who, growing up in this cult that they live in, always was trying to do the right thing, always trying to follow the rules, and yet she's the one who has to leave and has to escape. And Beth is the one who has always rebelled against the rules. She's never wanted anything to do with it. She's always just been looking for an opportunity to escape, but she's actually the one who has to stay a little bit longer and help other people. And both of their arcs were really well done, I thought. Initially, I was like, I don't know if we need Beth's POV. That feels a little unnecessary. But then as the story went on, I was like, oh, that's why we need it. So yeah, I thought all of that was just really well done. I thought again, the writing was good in terms of creating a sense of atmosphere. It was a little bit more of a sparse prose style, but I thought that worked well for the story. I didn't think the pacing of the story was perfect. I thought there was a very big event that obviously needed to happen, and I felt like it took kind of a long time for that to happen. And then after that event happened, the pacing didn't speed up. It actually kind of slowed down. So I didn't think that was perfect, but in spite of that, I was always like really excited to read the book again, just because it was so interesting, because of the characters, because of the dynamics, because of the questions that it was bringing up. It was just always really thought-provoking, and I was just always looking forward to spending more time with these characters and finding out what in the world was going to happen to them. The stakes were always so high, and not really because the world was ending, but because of what was happening to the specific characters. It is interesting always to have a story that is about the end of the world or the potential end of the world, because nobody is actually that worried about the world itself ending, but this book very much made me worry about these characters' world ending, regardless of what's going to happen to the larger world. So I thought it did a good job of that. This definitely wasn't a book that I entirely agreed with theologically or philosophically. It had a lot of things that I was like, I mean, I am uncomfortable with that personally, but I wasn't expecting to agree with this book theologically anyway. I didn't go in with that expectation. That wasn't really what it was for. And I did appreciate how it treated Christians with respect, which not every book about a cult that would claim to be Christian would actually do. I think the book could very easily have just gone and treated all Christians as terrible people, and that definitely isn't what happened. So I appreciated that, and it was very thought-provoking. It asked a lot of worldview questions, and the characters definitely grew as people. I was kind of surprised how much I was able to agree with versus what I was expecting. Number 7 is Of Fire and Ash by Jillian Bronte Adams, which you have seen before if you have watched my video about the books that I got at the Realmmakers Writers Conference. And I was a little bit nervous about it because of the large scale, except that I'd heard a lot of people say that it was really good. But the very huge scale of this fantasy world is pulled off really well. It feels like a cohesive world, but there's also a lot of variety within the world. So it actually feels like it's not just an alternate version of Western Europe or an alternate version of some part of Earth. It feels like it is its own world, and every culture within the world is very distinct and recognizable. I feel like I could see something from this world and immediately know what world it was from, and there are not a lot of worlds from fantasy where that's the case. I think it one of the main aspects that makes it so unique is, of course, the magic horses. That is a fire breathing horse that you see on that cover, and there are horses with all kinds of different superpowers. I really like how the people are not the ones with magical powers in this book. It's the horses that have magical powers, and some people then have bonds with these horses and can ride them and then kind of get superpowers from the horses a little bit, but it's really the horses are where it's at. And so I think that is so fun, and the author really does work with horses a lot. She has a lot of experience with horses, so all of the horse stuff is very much written from real experience, and I could definitely tell that, and I enjoyed that a lot. I was impressed how well the character development and plot were balanced, and how they each built into each other instead of detracting from each other. That is so hard to do, and so I was really impressed how each of the characters had a lot of internal work done on them. They all had good character arcs, even though there was so much happening in the plot and so much happening in the world building. It was just a really good balance. And in addition to that, the prose was also good. I feel like so many fantasy books that manage to pull off good plot and good character development have very sparse and kind of plain prose, which is okay. Sometimes that is actually sort of helpful with a very complicated story, but this one actually managed to pull off that prose that is more a style that I prefer. It also actually has a romance subplot that I like, and I am so picky about romance subplots. I'm so picky about them. So the fact that I am actually invested in a romance subplot in this book says a lot. I did not have many complaints about this book. Kind of the only thing is that one of the POVs, I felt like the plot was maybe going in circles a little bit for a while. It wasn't making as much progress as I felt like it should be, but then it still did have a satisfying ending, so it worked out. I just felt like that part was a little bit slow, and I was kind of like, when is this stuff gonna happen? But it was okay. And then the climax for the main character didn't leave me feeling like 100% satisfied, but this is also just the first book in a series, so I think that's maybe how it's kind of supposed to be, because this isn't the main conclusion. There's still more to come. I'm really excited for book 2 and then the future books in the series. I think this series is going to hit it out of the park, and I am so excited to have started it now. For number 6, I am cheating on 2 counts because I have 2 books and they are kind of part of a series, and the rest of the series is not on this list because I've already read it. So I am breaking some rules here, but I would say that these are not completely separate books because they are both part of the Middle-earth world, and I would also say that they are separate enough from Lord of the Rings to not be considered the same series. It's not like they're part of the same plot line like Stormlight Archive. So that's my excuse. My other excuse is that in 2021, I listed The Children of Hurin and The Fall of Gondolin in the same slot on my top 10 of the year list. So yeah, that's what I have to say for myself. But anyway, Beren and Luthien and The Fall of Numenor, which are both stories from the past of Middle-earth. These take place before Lord of the Rings and explain more of the history leading up to how Lord of the Rings happened. And they're an interesting combination because Beren and Luthien it started out as a fairy tale kind of story. It's relatively small scale. It's about Beren and Luthien and their relationship and their families and everything. And The Fall of Numenor spans the entire second age of Middle Earth and the entire island nation of Numenor. So it's this massive scale, takes place over like 1,000+ years. The Lord of the Rings super fans will be horrified that I don't remember exactly how many years it is, but so many people, so many time periods, so much happens, so much material. But they are both Middle-earth books, and they both really build into Lord of the Rings in a lot of interesting ways, and just even as standalones are very interesting books. The reason that I didn't list them even higher is mostly that they are not finished. These are works that Tolkien had written on for a long time, but they didn't get published during his lifetime. His son Christopher edited them and turned them into material that could be published. This one was worked on by other editors as well. But technically, especially Beren and Luthien is really several different versions of the story, and you get to see how the story progressed in Tolkien's mind. But the main version of the story, the Lay of Leithian, which is like the most incredible poetry you'll ever read. I'm telling you, it is crazy. And it's not finished. It only goes up to like one of the darkest moments in the story and then it stops, which is so terrible. The Fall of Numenor, actually, even though it has such a big scale and covers like 1,000+ years, it actually feels more like another Lord of the Rings novel, which is crazy. Like, it's just insane to think about getting another Middle Earth novel, but this does actually kind of feel like that to me. And it's fun that there are some stories in here that are very specific to individual people that feel more like novel type stories, and that was really cool to see. I know that this is material that's in the History of Middle Earth. I think some of it has also been in Unfinished Tales, so if you've read those, then you'll be familiar with a lot of the content in here. But it was so fun to see pretty much everything that we have about the Second Age of Middle Earth put together in one book. So if you're a big Tolkien fan, a big Lord of the Rings fan, you will definitely want to read both of these. They are so well done. If Tolkien could have actually properly completed them, they would have been number ones on my list for sure. Number 5 is the Earthsea series, specifically the first two books, Wizard of Earthsea and The Tombs of Atuan. Those were my two favorites in the series, and I won't talk about them too much because I've already made a video all about those two books, and this video is getting quite long already, and we still have my top 4 books to go, so I won't go into too much detail on these, but basically, they're so well written, the characters are so good, the plots are like the perfect external representation of the character arcs. I'm not sure I've seen anyone do that a whole lot better than Ursula Le Guin does in those two books, where everything that happens externally is just like the perfect representation of what's happening internally. And I did also like the 4 other books in the series, so I am including them with this listing, but I did think that the first 2 were the best, and the later books made me like The Tombs of Atuan just a tiny hair less, because they kind of made it sound like the old powers weren't actually evil, and I felt like it was so good for the Tombs of Atuan that the old powers were actually evil. So that took down my opinion of that just a hair, but overall it is just such a good solid series. You're not going to find much better writing, just as far as quality of writing. You're not going to find anything much better than this one. It's classic fantasy for a reason. Number 4 is The Little Prince, which I also talked about in my media wrap-up video, in addition to a couple other books on this list. But when I first checked out The Little Prince from the library, I was a little bit embarrassed because it was in this very kids book kind of binding. I was like, I haven't checked out a kids book in a long time. This is a little embarrassing. But I had heard that it was so good. I had seen part of the 2015 animated movie, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna read this, and I think it's probably going to be worth reading. And then the beginning started out a little slow and a little weird, and I was like, I don't know. But then once it got into the main story, it was so good. It was really, really well written. Evidently, the first draft of the book was 30,000 words, and then the author cut it down to 15,000 words. He cut out half of the words, and you can very much tell because every word is used so efficiently and so effectively. Every word is so carefully chosen, and the result is just this book that feels so wise and so intricately done, and the symbolism and the imagery is so good. The Little Prince is such a fun character. He's like childhood innocence, but also by the end of the book, he's this wise character who makes an impact on the adult aviator rather than the other way around. It's a book about childhood and adulthood, and it just does such a good job of portraying both of those and the transition between childhood and adulthood. The ending really surprised me. I did not think it was going to go there, but it went for it and it paid off. The ending was so good. So for this being a kid's book, for it, maybe coming in a very juvenile looking binding, it is a very deep story. It is one of the deepest stories that I read this year, one of the most carefully crafted stories that I read this year. So definitely don't let the children's story label concern you. It is very much worth reading, and it doesn't take very long, but please read it slowly and probably read it multiple times. I really should read it again because it was definitely worth it. Number 3 is Koenig's Fire, which may be the strangest book on this list. I I am so bad at pitching this book to people because I keep telling people it's paranormal horror Nazis. The forest fights back against the Nazis. It's so weird. It's so scary. You really need to read it. And I don't think that's an effective pitch for most people. For some reason, most people, when they hear it's bizarre and it's terrifying and it's about Nazis and paranormal horror, they don't want to read it for some reason. But it's really good though, and the uniqueness of that premise is part of why it's so good. And it is not just horror, it is not just scary, it is not just weird. It has a really well done main character who is an unreliable narrator. He there were moments where I just like had to pause and think for a minute because I was like that didn't just happen. He didn't just do that. No way. The main character is himself in the Nazi party, which is a unique point of view, and then finding out more and more about him as you go is really interesting. His character arc is amazing, and how he wrestles with the fact that he feels like he has no choice but to do these really terrible things, and he's like, if I don't do these really terrible things and just something worse is going to happen, how can I possibly navigate this situation well? And the setting is also really interesting because he's in this Nazi camp, if that's the right term, that is in this mine, and they can't get out of the mine. The forest won't let them leave. They can't break through the rocks. They're trapped. And so it's this very, again, small scale setting that is used to the best possible advantage for the story. Again, there is symbolism and imagery in here that is so well done and so thought provoking. It would have been so easy for this author to be content with very obvious symbolism and imagery, but he really makes you work for it. You have to think about it a lot. And for the fact that it is paranormal horror in a sense, and there's a lot of scary stuff, it never left me actually feeling scared in the I can't sleep now kind of way. It is so hopeful. There's a lot of light in this story. It never made me feel depressed at all. The thing that it actually makes you scared of is human evil, which is a good thing to be scared of. And also the ending, I am picky about endings, but this ending like hit it out of the park on so many levels. There was what I thought of as the climax, and I was like, okay, that was great, but I still feel like something's missing. There's something that needs to happen that hasn't happened yet, so I don't know. And it came through. It comes through. Don't worry, it will come through. The ending is so satisfying. It's so right. It feels so good when it finally comes. I can see why some people would have trouble with this story because it's not the most accessible thing ever. It's very surrealist. It made me think constantly of The Man Who Was Thursday. If you like The Man Who Was Thursday, this is your new favorite book right here. But it's not always the easiest thing to read, and if you're not already familiar with biblical symbolism and imagery, if you're not familiar with the classic literature that gets referenced here, then a lot of the symbolism that happens might just feel really confusing, and you might be like, well, what in the world is happening here? But if you do know what's going on with all of those illusions, then it's just mind-blowing how awesome it is. So this is the kind of story that very much appeals to my personality type, maybe not to yours, but if you think that maybe you have a similar personality to me, again, if you're a fan of The Man Who Was Thursday, if you like World War II books but wish they had some fantasy in them, then this is your new favorite book. Number 2 is The Last Unicorn, which I definitely did talk about this one in my mid-year wrap-up video. So again, I won't say too much about this one because I know I've already talked about it. Basically, it's a fairy tale, but very, very deep, very wise, very sad, very beautiful, similar to The Little Prince in a lot of those ways, but also very different. That's helpful. I know that's really helpful. Suffice it to say, it's written by the guy who wrote the introduction to Lord of the Rings. And if they pick a guy to write the introduction to the Lord of the Rings, and if he writes an introduction to the Lord of the Rings that becomes almost as classic as the book itself, then you know that he's a good writer. And he definitely is as good a novelist as he is an introduction writer. You should definitely give The Last Unicorn a try, even if it, again, looks like a kid's book, even if it sounds like My Little Pony because of the title. I think you'll like it a whole lot more than you think. Then, drumroll, I feel like there should be a big build up to this because we're ready for number 1, which is The Eye of the World, the first book of the Wheel of Time. I know this is not The Eye of the World, this is book 3 of the Wheel of Time, The Dragon Reborn, but I don't have The Eye of the World right now, so this is what we have. It's the same series. It will definitely work. So yeah, I like The Eye of the World a lot, which really surprised me. I was very, very reluctant to get into The Wheel of Time at all because it's such a long series. I was very intimidated by the 15-book commitment. I was like, I just don't know, because I had heard of some people who really loved it and some people who were like, it could kind of take it or leave it. I was like, I'm not going to read 15 huge books for a take it or leave it kind of series. So I decided that I was finally going to at least give book one a try. I felt like it deserved to at least have me attempt it. So I did give book one a try, and I kind of thought it was the best thing that I had read this year. I really, really liked it, and I was not expecting to like it that much. It does have a lot of fantasy tropes, so I think that's why a lot of people, even who really like Wheel of Time, aren't that enthusiastic about the Eye of the World. But one thing that I discovered this year is that I really like fantasy tropes. If they are pulled off well, if it feels unique enough, then I will like a book with fantasy tropes better than a book without them. I like them. I enjoy them. There were some things that were very similar to Lord of the Rings, but not as many as I was expecting. I thought it felt unique. I thought it felt like its own thing, and it was just well executed, even in the areas where it was similar to Lord of the Rings. It was done well, and it was different enough that I still liked it. I really enjoyed the characters. I enjoyed their character dynamics. I really liked that there were a lot of lighthearted and funny moments, and that again, it didn't feel like it had to be the most serious thing ever in the world all the time. I liked the bigness of the world. I thought the magic system was incredible, and I finished the book feeling like there really is enough material here for a series of 15 massive books, which I was very surprised to feel that way. I don't know where the books go from here, so please don't hear me saying that I endorse everything in the entire series, because I've only read through book 2 so far. I have not even started book 3 yet, but I will start it very soon because I hear that this is a good one in the series. So I know about the slog. I know that there are going to be some very slow books coming up where not a lot happens, but I still have high hopes for the series as a whole. And I think at least if the slog books do a good job of letting us spend time with the characters, I think I will not completely be disappointed with them, because I do just really like these characters. I really like just hanging out in the world. I did think the middle of book 1 was kind of slow, which is interesting because usually when I put something at number 1 on my list for the year, it's because I can't think of literally anything to say negative about it. And this year, that book for me was The Last Unicorn. There was like not a single word in that entire book that I would have changed if I could have. But The Eye of the World was on a much bigger scale, which made me feel like, okay, this is a more impressive technical feat because it is so massive, so many threads going on, so many complications, and it is still really good. So that was kind of why I put it at number 1, and I just enjoyed reading it so much. I think with a long, slightly slow book that is a little bit repetitive in the middle, you're not supposed to still like really enjoy reading it, but I just loved it. I thought the climax was so good. The climax was like the perfect ending to it. It was so strong. There were so many things I liked about it. I love the themes and how the themes are being developed in book 2 already. I am just really excited for the series, and I didn't think I was going to be, so that is a lot of fun, and I am looking forward to reading more of these through 2024. Well, you probably thought that you were done with this massively long video from me, but number 1 is not the end for this video, not at all, because we have number 0, Voices of the Future, Stories of Family and Fearlessness, an author conservatory student showcase. It's volume 1. I forgot to mention that in the title. This is the book that my short story is published in, so of course I can't actually put it on my list of top 10, but I legitimately did love reading this, not just because my short story is in it, but because all of the stories in it are very high quality. With an anthology, you kind of never know what you're going to get in terms of your fellow contributors and the stories that they're going to add to the collection. But I was very excited to read this and find that I am very happy to recommend this to people and to tell them that they should read it, because the stories are all very solid. They're all very well written. I enjoyed them a lot. And I do like People of the Rain, my short story. It would be kind of bad if I didn't, and I love it. It's so fun to be at the point where I can enjoy reading it as a story instead of worrying about editing it, and I think you will probably like it too. I've heard from so many readers that they have liked my story specifically and the anthology in general. It was so cool to actually get to read my book. I have not read the physical version of it yet, actually, so I still I should read it in the physical book just because I can now. But it has a great cover and it has great stories inside, so I would definitely recommend it to you. If you want your own copy of this, I will put a link to it down below. And if you would like to hear more updates about the anthology and about my writing journey as a whole, then you can sign up for my email newsletter. That will be the best way to get those updates, and I will put a link to that in the description as well. Okay, thank you guys for sticking with me through this long video. Let me know what your favorite books of 2023 were and what books you're most excited for in 2024, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye!